The strange story of mummy powder as a so-called medicine begins not with the Renaissance doctors who popularized it in Europe, but centuries earlier in the sands of ancient Egypt, where the practice of mummification created the preserved bodies that later became the raw material for a bizarre medical industry. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife where the body was needed for the soul to return. So through embalming techniques, drying with natron, wrapping with linen, and using resins and bitumen, they preserved corpses for eternity. But medieval Europeans, coming into contact with these remains through trade and conquest, misunderstood the purpose and nature of these substances, confusing the word mumia, which in Arabic referred to a natural asphalt or bitumen used in embalming, with the mummified flesh itself. So what started as a confusion of language and medicine grew into the belief that the black, resinous material clinging to ancient Egyptian corpses was a potent curative. By the 12th century, crusaders and merchants returning from the Middle East carried stories and samples of this mumia, which was thought to have healing properties because it contained bitumen, then considered a universal remedy, and because of the long-held belief in the doctrine of signatures, the idea that substances resembling certain aspects of life or death could influence the human body so powdered, mummy was thought to cure internal bleeding, bruises, epilepsy, and even plague, as though ingesting the preserved power of the ancients could restore vitality. Medieval apothecaries began to import chunks of mummified flesh and grind them into powders to be swallowed or mixed with drinks, while physicians prescribed these remedies to kings and commoners alike. And in an age when humoral medicine dominated, the desiccated, resin-filled tissue of a mummy seemed like it could rebalance the body's fluids by drying excessive humors. This fascination with death as a source of life-giving medicine was not unique to mummies, since bloodletting, powdered bones, and even ground-up skulls were also prescribed. But the allure of Egypt, its mystery, and its antiquity made mummies particularly prized. Ironically, the Egyptians had preserved their dead for religious and spiritual reasons, yet Europeans desecrated these remains for purely utilitarian and commercial purposes, turning sacred tombs into pharmacies. The early demand for mumia was not limited to physicians but extended to laypeople who bought vials of the powder at markets or from itinerant healers, and it was so widely accepted that it entered the pharmacopoeia of respected doctors like Guy de la Fontaine and Ambroise Paré, though Paré eventually exposed much of it as quackery. Yet before skepticism took hold, the cultural and religious foundations of medieval Europe, steeped in relic worship, alchemy, and the blending of magic with medicine, made the idea of consuming the flesh of the ancient dead seem not only plausible but powerful. For if saints' bones could heal the faithful, why not the bodies of those preserved for millennia by a civilization associated with mystical knowledge? Thus, the origins of mummy powder as a medicine were not merely an odd accident, but the result of a convergence of linguistic confusion, spiritual symbolism, humoral theory, and the allure of exotic imports, all of which prepared Europe to embrace the consumption of actual human remains as though they were a gift from antiquity. The practice that began with mistranslation and superstition would expand into a booming trade, supplying apothecaries across the continent with the flesh of the long dead, and in this way, the misunderstanding of mumia and the hunger for miraculous cures birthed one of history's strangest and most macabre medical traditions. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the use of mummy powder in medicine had moved from a curious exotic practice to a mainstream phenomenon that spread throughout Europe, fueled by apothecaries, physicians, and merchants who saw in the embalmed remains of ancient Egyptians both profit and promise, and so entire industries arose around the acquisition, preparation, and sale of mummy flesh, which was considered a potent therapeutic substance. European doctors in the 15th and 16th centuries routinely prescribed powdered mummy for ailments ranging from headaches and stomach pains to epilepsy, bruising, poisoning, and plague, believing that because mummified flesh contained resin and bitumen, substances already thought to have preservative and healing qualities, the medicine would impart those powers to the living body, especially when applied to injuries involving blood loss since the dark. Coagulated appearance of the powdered flesh seemed to symbolically stop bleeding and restore vitality, a reasoning that fit perfectly with the doctrine of signatures. The Renaissance medical belief that God had marked every natural object with a sign of its usefulness to human health. Recipes varied. Some called for dried powder made by grinding the skin and muscle into a fine dust to be swallowed with wine, while others mixed the substance with honey, vinegar, or treacle to mask the taste. And there were also tinctures created by soaking strips of mummy flesh in alcohol, so the essence could be ingested as a liquid. Royal courts and wealthy elites were especially fond of this medicine, with figures such as King Francis I of France reportedly carrying powdered mummy in a pouch to take whenever he felt ill or injured. And Elizabethan England saw similar fascination, where doctors stocked true Egyptian mummy in their cabinets, alongside unicorn horn, bezoar stones, and other exotic remedies. The supply chain that supported this practice was as bizarre as the medicine itself, for it required either the looting of actual Egyptian tombs, the black market sale of mummies from Cairo, or the manufacture of fraudulent substitutes, since the demand in Europe quickly exceeded the availability of genuine ancient remains, leading unscrupulous traders to murder travelers or criminals, dry their corpses, coat them in bitumen, and sell them as authentic Egyptian products. So the very idea of curing disease with ancient sanctity was often corrupted by the consumption of recently killed bodies disguised as antiquities. Yet even with these moral and practical concerns, mummy medicine flourished, and apothecaries advertised it openly in their shops, grinding the material into powders displayed in jars labeled as mumia vera aegyptiaca, while doctors debated the best forms of preparation, whether pulverized bone, resinous tissue, or oil extracted from the body, a substance called oil of mummy that was sometimes applied externally to wounds. Cultural fascination with Egypt, with its pyramids, hieroglyphs, and aura of ancient wisdom, only heightened the appeal. And as Renaissance Europe sought to recover lost knowledge from antiquity, the bodies of the Egyptians themselves seemed to be the ultimate repository of power, so ingesting them was seen as a way of reclaiming that ancient force. Still, there were critics. Ambroise Paré, the famous French surgeon of the 16th century, mocked the practice as absurd, pointing out that many supposed mummies were fake and that the idea of healing through cannibalism was grotesque. Yet even Paré's denunciations could not halt the momentum of centuries of tradition, because patients demanded what they believed worked, and physicians, lacking better options, prescribed what seemed to bring results, especially when placebo effects and natural healing were interpreted as proof of efficacy. This consumption of the dead was not limited to powdered flesh, for entire skulls were ground into remedies, bones were boiled into tonics, and human fat was applied to wounds, showing that European medicine of the time had a cannibalistic dimension that seems shocking today, but was normalized then. In that context, mummy powder was simply the most exotic and prestigious version of a wider practice of medicinal cannibalism, one that revealed both the desperation of societies ravaged by plague, famine, and war, and the willingness to consume anything that might promise survival. Trade networks expanded to meet demand, with caravans transporting wrapped corpses from Egypt to Mediterranean ports, where Venetian and Genoese merchants resold them across Europe, while apothecaries wrote to one another about the quality and authenticity of their supplies, noting that the best mummies were those blackened with resin, strongly aromatic and hard, whereas fraudulent corpses smelled rancid or crumbled easily. It was a market as much about illusion as about medicine, and yet its reach extended into every corner of European life, from the royal palace to the village healer's hut. The rise of mummy medicine thus reflected a unique intersection of commerce, superstition, and early science, where the scarcity of effective treatments made even the most macabre substances seem acceptable, and where fascination with antiquity turned the bodies of the long dead into commodities. The sheer scale of the trade is difficult to measure, but records suggest that thousands of mummies were destroyed, ground up, and swallowed by Europeans between the 12th and 17th centuries, their sacred remains desecrated in the name of healing, and in this way, the Renaissance quest for knowledge and cure produced one of history's strangest medical practices, a grim reminder of how cultural misunderstanding, desperation, and commerce can combine to create an industry rooted in the consumption of human remains. As the Renaissance gave way to the early modern period, mummy powder was no longer a strange curiosity reserved for elite physicians, but had become embedded in the broader culture of Europe. influencing not only medicine but also art, literature, commerce, and even the way Europeans imagined their relationship with the ancient world. For the demand for mumia vera was so great that it reshaped trade routes, inspired frauds, and left a lasting mark on the cultural imagination. The fascination with mummies and their supposed powers can be seen in how they entered everyday life, sold in open markets, prescribed by respected physicians, and kept in the medicine cabinets of households, while the wealthy and powerful flaunted their access to true Egyptian mummy as a status symbol, much as they did with rare spices, gems, or exotic animals, since having such a potent and costly remedy signaled both sophistication and access to global trade networks. The impact extended into art, where mummy brown, a pigment made from ground-up mummies, was used by European painters from the 17th through 19th centuries, lending a literal touch of antiquity to canvases that now hang in major museums, a practice that demonstrates how the bodies of ancient Egyptians were consumed, not only through medicine, but also through culture, becoming both medicine and material for artistic expression. Mummy medicine also connected directly to the colonialist and Orientalist impulses of the time, as Europeans increasingly saw the East not only as a source of luxury goods, but also as a reservoir of mystical knowledge and resources to be plundered. And the very act of consuming mummified flesh reflected a symbolic domination over Egypt, transforming its most sacred relics into commodities for European consumption, a process that mirrored the broader patterns of imperial exploitation that would intensify in the centuries to come. Moreover, the practice was entangled with the fascination for relics and the supernatural, since in a society where saints' bones, holy blood, and miraculous oils were revered as sacred, the bodies of mummified Egyptians, wrapped in mystery, antiquity, and the aura of forbidden knowledge, seemed like natural extensions of that system of belief, allowing people to imagine they were ingesting not just medicine, but also the distilled essence of ancient wisdom and power. As demand outstripped supply, the trade in mummy flesh became increasingly fraudulent, with criminals in Egypt and the Middle East drying the bodies of beggars, slaves and executed prisoners, coating them with bitumen and passing them off as genuine, while in Europe, apothecaries often could not tell the difference and sometimes knowingly sold counterfeit products to satisfy their customers, meaning that many who thought they were consuming the sacred remains of ancient pharaohs were actually ingesting the flesh of far more recent and less illustrious corpses, an irony that illustrates both the absurdity and the moral darkness of the trade. Yet the cultural fascination did not diminish, for Europe was enthralled by Egyptomania long before the 19th century craze sparked by Napoleon's expedition. And already in the 16th and 17th centuries, travelers, scholars, and collectors filled their cabinets of curiosity with mummy fragments, both as medical supplies and as exotic relics. And this collecting mania reflected the Renaissance desire to possess the wonders of the world, to bring the strange and distant into one's own home as both spectacle and source of knowledge. The idea of mummies as powerful objects also filtered into literature and folklore, where tales circulated of their mysterious powers, curses, and magical qualities, reinforcing the aura of potency that justified their medicinal use. And so mummy powder became part of a cultural ecosystem that combined medicine, mysticism, trade, and art into a single phenomenon. This expansion also had ethical consequences, for the looting of Egyptian tombs intensified, with European merchants bribing locals to desecrate graves and remove bodies, reducing what had once been sacred burial sites into resource pits for European markets. And the Egyptian dead became one of the many resources extracted from colonized lands to serve European needs, foreshadowing the much larger waves of cultural appropriation and theft that characterized imperialism. The sheer popularity of mummy remedies also meant that they shaped European views of medicine and health, reinforcing the belief that the human body itself could be a source of healing when processed and consumed, a notion that blurred the lines between cannibalism and pharmacology, and has fascinated historians ever since, because it shows how cultural values determine what is considered medicine and what is considered taboo. At the same time, critics grew louder, with some scholars and physicians questioning both the authenticity of the mummy trade and the morality of consuming human flesh. And the more fraudulent the trade became, the more its credibility suffered. paving the way for its eventual decline in the 17th and 18th centuries, but not before it had already left a deep imprint on European culture, both materially, in the form of art, literature and medicine, and symbolically, in the way it reinforced Europe's self-image as heir to and consumer of the ancient world. Even today, the cultural memory of mummy medicine persists in the way we imagine mummies in horror films, Gothic novels, and Halloween imagery, for the idea of consuming or being consumed by the ancient dead continues to resonate in the Western imagination, a lingering echo of the centuries when powdered pharaohs were prescribed for headaches and plague. In this sense, the cultural impact of mummy powder went far beyond the medical sphere, shaping trade, art, literature, and the collective imagination of Europe in ways that reflected both the era's thirst for wonder and its willingness to exploit the dead in pursuit of life, a paradox that underscores the strangeness of this chapter in medical history. By the 17th century, the practice of using mummy powder as medicine began to face mounting skepticism, as advances in anatomy, chemistry, and medical observation gradually shifted European medicine away from superstition and toward empirical science. Though the decline was neither immediate nor absolute, for mummy remedies continued to be sold and prescribed well into the 18th century, and in some cases even the 19th, demonstrating both the resilience of tradition and the slowness of medical reform. Critics like Ambroise Paré in France, who had already mocked the practice as little more than cannibalism disguised as medicine, were joined by other physicians who pointed out that the supposed efficacy of powdered mummy could often be explained by natural healing processes, placebo effects, or simply the fact that patients were consuming resins and bitumen with mild antiseptic properties rather than the flesh itself. And as pharmacology advanced, alternatives such as quinine, opium, and other plant-based remedies made the consumption of human remains increasingly unnecessary and embarrassing. By the Enlightenment, when reason and rationalism were valued above superstition, the very idea of ingesting ground-up corpses seemed grotesque and unscientific, and satirical writers began to lampoon the practice, portraying physicians as charlatans who literally fed their patients the dead, exposing the macabre absurdity of the tradition to public ridicule. At the same time, the mummy trade itself was becoming more difficult to sustain, as Egyptian tombs were looted to the point of depletion and counterfeit products flooded the market, making it harder to convince patients and doctors alike of the authenticity of the medicine. And in many cases, what was sold as mumia vera was nothing more than dried animal flesh, resin, or recently executed bodies, all of which further undermined the credibility of the practice. Yet even as the medical legitimacy of mummy powder declined, its symbolic and cultural legacy endured, for the fascination with mummies did not disappear, but instead transformed, shifting from the apothecary's jar to the collector's cabinet, and then into the realms of archaeology, tourism, and popular culture. The 19th century, particularly after Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, and the subsequent decipherment of hieroglyphs by Champollion, saw the explosion of Egyptomania, with Europeans obsessively collecting, displaying, and studying mummies, no longer to consume them as medicine, but to possess them as cultural trophies. Yet the echoes of the earlier practice of ingestion lingered, shaping the aura of horror and fascination that clings to mummies in Western imagination. Stories of the mummy's curse and Gothic tales of the undead preserved body can be traced back in part to the uneasy recognition that for centuries Europeans had desecrated and devoured the Egyptian dead, a collective guilt that resurfaced in folklore and literature. Artists, too, continued to use mummy-brown pigment into the 19th century, until awareness of its true origin, actual ground-up human remains, led to its abandonment in favor of synthetic alternatives, a symbolic moment when cultural consumption of mummies finally gave way to more ethical substitutes. The legacy of mummy medicine also forces modern reflection on the boundaries of science and superstition, reminding us how easily medical authority can legitimize practices that today seem abhorrent, and how cultural fascination with the exotic and the ancient can lead to exploitation and desecration in the name of healing. In modern archaeology and heritage ethics, the centuries of looting and consumption of Egyptian bodies are viewed as a dark chapter of colonial appropriation, a time when the dead were denied dignity and turned into commodities for foreign markets, and contemporary debates over the repatriation of mummies and artifacts to Egypt are partly shaped by this history, as curators and historians acknowledge the violence of these past practices. Yet the fascination endures in different forms, for mummies remain central figures in popular culture, from Gothic novels of the 19th century to Universal Studios' horror films of the 20th and countless modern reinventions in games, comics and cinema, where the mummy is no longer medicine but monster, a figure of dread whose return embodies both the allure and the horror of the ancient dead. Scholars note that this cultural reimagining is itself a legacy of the earlier medicinal practice, a way of sublimating the collective memory of consuming the dead into stories where the dead now rise to consume the living. An inversion of the old medicinal cannibalism that haunted Europe for centuries. In this way, the decline of mummy powder as medicine did not erase its impact but transformed it, leaving a double legacy. On the one hand, it stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncritical medicine, superstition and exploitation, while on the other, it continues to inspire fascination, fear, and creativity in the collective imagination. The fact that people once eagerly ingested ground-up pharaohs to cure headaches or bruises strikes modern audiences as macabre and absurd, yet it reveals much about the history of medicine, showing how belief, desperation, and cultural symbolism can override ethics and reason, and it underscores the importance of skepticism, evidence, and respect for the dead in medical practice today. Thus, the story of mummy powder's decline and legacy is not simply one of error corrected, but of a cultural phenomenon that, even after losing its medical standing, persisted in shaping art, literature, popular culture, and historical consciousness, ensuring that the memory of this strangest of remedies lives on long after the last apothecary jar of powdered flesh disappeared from the shelves.